ruthless billionaire spent years hiding his secret. 3 children he abandoned and the woman he tried to erase. But when she storms into his glittering empire with undeniable proof, his perfect world begins to crumble. Will he risk everything to finally claim the family he never had the courage to acknowledge? Or will pride destroy his last chance at redemption? Discover how one woman's quiet strength shatters a lifetime of lies. Where are you watching from? Share in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more stories that touch the heart and challenge the soul. Damian Whitaker adjusted the lapel of his impeccably tailored midnight blue tuxedo, surveying the ballroom as though he owned not just the company, but the entire city. In many ways, he did. Whitaker Holdings occupied 40 floors of the glass monolith that glimmered above Manhattan's skyline. Tonight, he'd spared no expense to celebrate the launch of their record-breaking IPO, the culmination of a decade's worth of ruthlessness. The chandeliers, priceless French antiques, dripped with light over an ocean of black-tie guests, each vying to shake Damian's hand and curry favor. Champagne flutes balanced delicately on manicured fingers. Waiters in crisp uniforms floated through the crowd, delivering amuse-bouches with practiced grace. In the corner, a string quartet coaxed Mozart from mahogany instruments. Damian smiled faintly as he walked the perimeter, greeting senators, CEOs, and billionaires with the same cool civility. The air smelled of success, and he intended to savor it. He was halfway through a bland conversation with a venture capitalist when he glimpsed a flicker of movement near the arched entrance. A woman in a plain gray uniform knelt beside a brass waste bin, wiping a pale smudge from the marble. She moved with quiet efficiency, shoulders slightly hunched as though she hoped to disappear behind the grandeur. For a moment, Damian's gaze caught on the curve of her jaw, a shadow of familiarity he could not place. But the thought vanished as quickly as it came. She was the cleaning staff, nameless, interchangeable. He returned his attention to his guest, but something petty and sour coiled in his gut. Damian had built an empire on precision, perfection, and image. A cleaning lady disrupting the view of his triumph. It offended him on a level deeper than logic. He excused himself from the conversation with a cold nod and strode purposefully across the polished floor, the crowd parting to let him through. As he approached, the woman sensed his presence. She did not look up right away, merely finished wiping the stain before placing the rag in her small caddy. When she finally raised her face, her dark eyes met his with unsettling steadiness. A hint of something, recognition, defiance passed between them, but Damian refused to name it. "You," he said, his voice low and cutting. "What is your name?" The woman's expression didn't flicker. "Alicia, sir." "Alicia," he repeated, savoring the way her name sounded almost delicate in the air. "Do you have any idea what this event represents?" "Yes, sir." He raised an eyebrow. "Enlighten me." She shifted the cleaning caddy against her hip. "It's the IPO launch celebration. Whitaker Holdings went public this morning." Her answer was so precise, it startled him. His irritation deepened. "Then you should understand why the staff were instructed to complete their duties before the guests arrived. I assume you can read?" A ripple of discomfort passed through the nearest onlookers, but no one dared intervene. Damian's voice carried just enough volume to command attention. "I was assigned to this wing," Alicia replied evenly. "I stayed to finish the marble cleaning because there were footprints." Damian narrowed his eyes. "Footprints?" "Yes, sir." He let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Do you know what I see when I look at you on your knees, scrubbing my floor during the most important night of my career?" Her jaw tightened imperceptibly. "No, sir." "I see a cautionary tale," he continued, his tones silk over steel. "You are precisely what happens when people refuse to work hard enough to rise above their circumstances. Do you think anyone here admires your dedication? You are invisible, and that is the best you can hope for." Alicia's dark eyes did not waver. Her voice, when it came, was almost soft. "If that's what you need to believe." He felt the heat rise in his chest. How dare she stand there, meeting his gaze as though they were equals? He had clawed his way from nothing, born in a rotting duplex in Queens, and he'd remade himself into a man who owned everything he surveyed. It was his right to look down on those who hadn't. "Let me be clear," Damian said, pitching his voice so the nearest tables would hear. Your presence here insults everyone who fought to be part of this moment. I suggest you collect your supplies and exit through the service hallway before I have you escorted out." For a second, he thought she would argue. Instead, Alicia bent gracefully to pick up her cleaning kit. But as she turned to leave, she paused and looked over her shoulder, her expression as calm as falling snow. "One day," she said in that same soft tone, "you will wish you'd never said that." Damien felt the blood drain from his face. The words, innocuous on the surface, struck some hidden nerve. He opened his mouth to retort, but she was already moving toward the corridor beyond the catering stations. The crowd slowly turned away, conversations resuming with the brittle energy of people desperate to pretend nothing awkward had happened. He stood motionless, his hands clenched at his sides. 1,000 tiny humiliations in his life had taught him to destroy threats early. He decided then that this Alicia would not return tomorrow. "Mr. Whitaker?" He looked over to find Helen approaching. His younger sister wore a column of emerald silk that flattered her figure and softened her sharp features. She was 2 years younger and had always been his conscience, though he rarely listened to it. "I'm busy," he said flatly. Helen glanced in the direction Alicia had gone. "That was cruel, Damien." "She was out of place," he snapped. "You don't tolerate a stain on your suit, do you?" Helen studied him for a moment with those unsettlingly perceptive eyes. "Sometimes I wonder if you remember who you used to be." His mouth tightened. "I remember better than you think." He turned on his heel and strode away, needing the validation of the crowd to steady him. Each handshake was a reminder that he was a man who mattered, whose name would outlast the critics and the inconveniences. But beneath his certainty, something coiled and uneasy began to stir, a premonition that he had just set something unstoppable in motion. Alicia stepped into the service hallway, the door closing behind her with a muffled thud. The sudden quiet pressed against her ears like cotton. She braced herself against the cool cinder-block wall, her hands trembling now that no one could see. 12 years she had kept her silence, honored the contract she'd been forced to sign. 12 years she had raised the boys alone, carrying both the fear and the fierce love that had shaped every choice she made. Watching Damien tonight, so polished in his triumph, she felt the old bitterness surge like acid in her throat. He thought she was nothing. He thought she was powerless. Alicia reached into her pocket and touched the sealed envelope, the DNA results she had never intended to use. Her breath caught as she felt the weight of it, the truth humming beneath her fingertips. She could still walk away, she could still disappear again, and no one would ever know. But as she remembered the way Damien's voice had sliced through the air, "You are invisible," something inside her hardened. She thought of Noah's shy smile, Caleb's restless questions, Ethan's solemn eyes. She thought of all the nights she had told them their father was far away because he was too important to come home. Alicia straightened her shoulders and wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. Let Damien have his precious moment in the spotlight. Let him bask in his illusions. She had survived far worse than his contempt, but she would not stay invisible. Not anymore. In the ballroom, Damien resumed his circuit of the guests, but the champagne tasted sour on his tongue. Every time he caught a glimpse of the polished marble floor, he remembered her words. "One day, you'll wish you'd never said that." He didn't know it yet, but she was right. Alicia Monroe had never imagined she would return to Manhattan. 12 years ago, she had left in a stolen taxicab, her belly heavy with 3 unborn sons, and her heart splintered into pieces so small she believed no one would ever find them. She remembered every detail of that night. The dim hospital corridor where she waited alone, the flickering fluorescent light that sputtered overhead, and the legal document that pinned her to silence with the weight of 1,000 unspoken threats. The memory returned with brutal clarity as she stepped off the bus in the pre-dawn dark, the cold November wind slicing through her thin coat. The boys were still asleep back in the cheap motel in Newark where she'd left them with her friend Leah. She would have to pick them up before school. But first, she needed to secure a job, any job, that would stop the eviction notice from becoming an eviction. Her hand moved automatically to the envelope in her bag, the one she had carried from city to city for over a decade. Inside, the The DNA test results waited like a dormant fuse. She had sworn to herself she would never light it. But as the months passed and the bills piled up, the weight of that promise grew heavier. Alicia pulled the collar of her coat higher around her neck and walked toward the squat brick building where the agency offices rented space. The sign on the door read Horizon Facility Services in peeling white letters. Inside, a single receptionist, an elderly woman with a halo of pink-dyed curls, sat behind a laminate desk. She peered over her glasses as Alicia approached. "Paperwork?" the woman asked, her voice gravelly with sleep. Alicia handed over the file she'd prepared the night before, carefully omitting certain facts. Her previous address, the gap in employment after the twins were born, the names she hoped never to see again. The receptionist flipped through the pages with a nonchalance that made Alicia's heart hammer. She had come too far to be turned away. The woman said finally. "Have you done high-profile event work before?" "Yes," Alicia lied. "You'll need to be discreet. The client likes his staff invisible." Invisible. The word curdled in her stomach, but she only nodded. "Report here tomorrow at 6 sharp. Uniform pickup is down the hall." When she emerged 20 minutes later, carrying a plastic-wrapped gray uniform, identical to the one she had worn the night before, dawn was beginning to break over the city's jagged rooftops. The streets glistened with last night's rain, and the morning crowd poured from the subway tunnels like water through a breach. Alicia made her way back to the motel, her mind a whirl of logistics. Bus fare, school registration forms, the phone call to her landlord she could no longer delay. But beneath the mundane details, a deeper dread thrummed. She had walked straight into the heart of the life she'd abandoned, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it recognized her. Leah was sitting cross-legged on one of the motel beds, braiding Caleb's hair while Ethan drew circles on a notepad. Noah was perched by the window, his solemn gaze fixed on the parking lot below. The moment Alicia stepped inside, all three boys lifted their faces in unison, the same wide brown eyes locking onto hers. "Mom?" Noah said quietly. "Are we moving again?" "Not yet," she said, forcing a smile. "I found some work." Ethan looked up, his voice tentative. "Will you have to leave at night?" "Sometimes." She crouched to their level, smoothing Caleb's cheek with her thumb. "But I promise you, this is only for a little while." She wished it were true. That night, as the boys slept in their borrowed beds, Alicia sat cross-legged on the floor and laid the envelope flat on the thin carpet. It had followed her from state to state, never opened but never discarded, like a talisman she both feared and needed. The lab slip was still crisp inside, the words stark and inarguable. Probability of paternity 99.99%. Damian Whitaker. Once, she had imagined the name would mean something to him. She had waited, hoping he would call, hoping he would look for her when she disappeared. But no message ever came. When the first hospital bill arrived, she understood. She was a problem to be contained, a risk to be neutralized. Her hand trembled as she traced the letters with her fingertip. She could still see the pride on his face when he closed the deal that became the foundation of Whitaker Holdings. Even then, she had known he would choose ambition over anything else, but she hadn't expected him to pretend she never existed. A sharp rap at the door snapped her out of the memory. She folded the envelope back into her bag before crossing to answer it. Leah stood in the hallway, her arms wrapped around her middle. "Rent's due tomorrow," Leah murmured. "My uncle says he can't float us any longer." Alicia swallowed. "I start work in the morning." "That's good," Leah said. She hesitated. "You could always tell him." "I won't," Alicia said too quickly. "You say that, but the boys, I won't." Leah's eyes softened. "Just promise me you'll think about what they deserve." When the door closed, Alicia leaned against it, pressing her palm over her mouth. She thought about what her children deserved every day. Stability, a future, a father. But the reality was colder and simpler. She was alone, and she would always be alone. Sleep didn't come. At dawn, she dressed in the gray uniform, pinned her hair back, and kissed each boy's forehead as they slumbered. Noah's brow furrowed as he stirred. She whispered that she would be back soon, that she loved them more than any words could say. At precisely 6, she stood in the service hallway of the Whitaker Holdings Tower, her ID badge clipped discreetly at her hip. She felt like an intruder in the world she had once dared to believe she belonged to. The polished brass elevators glided silently up to the executive floor. Alicia stepped out and surveyed the gleaming reception area, the same herringbone floors she had walked 12 years before. She was halfway to the supply closet when a familiar voice behind her stopped her cold. "You." Her heart slammed against her ribs. Slowly, she turned. Helen Whitaker stood by the glass railing, dressed in a tailored navy suit that seemed designed to project competence without warmth. She looked older than Alicia remembered, sharper somehow. But her eyes were the same, clear and assessing. "Miss Whitaker," Alicia said, her voice soft. Helen tilted her row. The words fell between them like a stone dropped into still water. "I thought you'd left the city," Helen continued. "I did. And now you're back." "I needed work." Helen studied her, something flickering across her face that might have been sympathy or suspicion. "You know my brother won't take kindly to your presence." "I'm aware." "Then why are you here?" Alicia looked away. "Because I don't have the luxury of pride." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Helen sighed. "You were always different from the others." "I'm not here to cause trouble." Helen's gaze sharpened. "But you could." Alicia didn't answer. Helen's phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen before tucking it away. "If you plan to stay, you should know Damien has a long memory for perceived slights. Be careful." "I will." With that, Helen turned and disappeared down the corridor. Alicia exhaled shakily, her hands clenched around her cleaning caddy. She was no threat, she reminded herself. She was just a woman trying to survive. But even as she tried to believe it, the truth whispered in the back of her mind. She could destroy everything Damien had built with a single piece of paper. She didn't want revenge. She wanted her children to have what they deserved. Yet, as the hours crept by, scrubbing immaculate floors and wiping polished surfaces, Alicia felt something harden in her chest. Damien's voice echoed there, cold and dismissive. "You are invisible." She wasn't. Not anymore. Late that night, she returned to the motel to find Noah waiting awake, his face pale in the blue glow of the television. When she slipped inside, he clambered into her lap without a word, curling against her heart. "Mom," he whispered. "When are we going home?" Alicia closed her eyes, pressing her lips to his hair. "Soon," she lied, but she knew the truth. Home was no longer somewhere she could return. It was something she would have to build from the ashes of what she left behind. The next morning dawned brittle and gray, with a cold wind battering the windows of the Whitaker Holdings tower. Alicia arrived before dawn, her uniform pressed and her hair pulled into the same tight knot she'd worn all those years ago when she still believed that respectability would protect her. She didn't meet the eyes of the other cleaning staff as she slipped into the service elevator and pressed the button for the executive floors. In her chest, her heart thudded with something she refused to name. Fear, or maybe resolve. The lobby was quiet when she stepped out. The only sounds the muffled hum of air vents and the whisper of her sneakers on the polished floor. She moved with careful precision, checking her list of assignments and unlocking the first of the conference rooms she'd been assigned to clean. Every motion was deliberate, practiced, invisible. That was how she intended to remain. But as she set about dusting the mahogany credenza beneath the long windows, she couldn't stop the unease that coiled beneath her ribs. She had felt it since Helen had looked her in the eye and spoken those careful words. "If you plan to stay, be careful." Careful was not a luxury she could afford anymore. A chime sounded from the reception desk, and Alicia's head jerked up. Through the glass doors, she saw the first of the executives arriving, their silhouettes tall and purposeful beneath the recessed lights. She ducked her head and kept her eyes on her work, praying that none of them would bother to look closely enough to recognize her face. She moved to the next room, and the next. Hours blurred into each other, punctuated only by the squeak of the cartwheels and the soft hiss of cleaning spray on glass. It wasn't until she returned to the central hallway that she saw him. Damien stood alone by the elevator bank, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw tight as though he were bracing himself for an unpleasant duty. His gaze swept the corridor and landed on her. For an instant, she thought he would look away. Instead, his eyes narrowed, and he started walking toward her. Alicia's pulse leapt into her throat. She set her cloth aside, straightening as he approached. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice pitched low enough that no one else would hear. Her mouth went dry. She hadn't heard him say her name in more than a decade. Yes, Mr. Whitaker. He studied her face with a scrutiny that made her skin prickle. You were informed you would be reassigned to the lower floors. I was told to report to this wing, she said evenly. By whom? The staffing coordinator. A muscle ticked in his jaw. Then it appears someone is confused. This is the executive wing. It is not appropriate for support staff. Alicia felt something inside her splinter, but her voice remained calm. I understand. I'll finish this floor today, and tomorrow I'll report to the new assignment. His gaze did not soften. You will finish now. She gripped the edge of her cart. I haven't completed the checklist. I'll sign off on it myself. Their eyes locked, and the moment stretched taut as piano wire. Behind Damien's cold composure, she glimpsed something that looked suspiciously like unease. He was afraid she would make a scene. He was afraid she would reveal everything he had buried. But Alicia only inclined her head. As you wish. She gathered her supplies and maneuvered her cart to the elevator, refusing to let her shoulders slump until the doors closed behind her. As the car descended, her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped her caddy. She had known it would be difficult to see him again, but nothing could have prepared her for the hollow ache that seeing his face would summon. The years hadn't changed him much. If anything, he was sharper, more polished, more certain of his own entitlement. She thought of the boys waiting at school for her return and felt her determination coalesce into something solid and cold. He would not erase her this time. At the end of her shift, Alicia returned to the motel in Newark to find Leah pacing outside their door, her face pinched with worry. He called, Leah blurted the moment Alicia stepped onto the cracked walkway. Alicia froze. Who? Some man from Whitaker Holdings. He asked if you were here, if you'd use this address on your application. Alicia's heart sank. She clenched her jaw, feeling a dull panic gnawing at her composure. What did you tell him? Nothing. I said you weren't home and hung up. Alicia exhaled slowly, pressing her hand to her temple. Thank you. Leah lowered her voice. He's trying to get rid of you. I know. Leah touched her arm. You can't keep pretending this will go away. He's not going to let you stay invisible. Alicia's throat tightened. I'm not trying to be invisible anymore. Then what are you trying to do? She didn't answer, because the truth was too complicated to explain. She was trying to protect her boys, trying to reclaim a piece of herself, trying to survive in a world that had never offered her anything but contempt. That night, after the children were asleep, she pulled the envelope from her bag and stared at it for a long time. She traced the seal with her thumb until her skin felt raw. Damien had built his life on the illusion that he could control every variable, that his past had no power to reach into his present. She could destroy that illusion with a single piece of paper. But destruction was not what she wanted. She wanted acknowledgement. She wanted her children to know they were not mistakes. A knock sounded on the door, sharp and authoritative. Alicia's heart slammed against her ribs as she tucked the envelope beneath the mattress. Leah appeared in the doorway to the adjoining room, her eyes wide with alarm. Stay with them, Alicia whispered, gesturing toward the boys' beds. Leah nodded, vanishing back into the shadows. Alicia drew a steadying breath and opened the door. A man in an expensive gray suit stood on the threshold, a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. His hair was dark, peppered with silver at the temples, and his expression was as impassive as a statue's. Miss Monroe? He asked. Yes. I'm Mr. Whitaker's legal counsel. May I come in? No, she said, her voice steady. You can say whatever you need to say here. His gaze flicked past her shoulder to the dim interior of the room. Very well. He opened the folder and withdrew a sheaf of papers. I have been authorized to present you with a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement. Alicia felt her fingers curl into fists. I'm not interested. You should read the terms before you decide. I know what the terms will be. He cleared his throat delicately. Miss Monroe, my client is prepared to be extremely generous. You will be compensated for your time and your circumstances. My circumstances? She repeated, her voice flat. You will also be provided with relocation assistance if you agree to depart the city immediately and surrender any documentation you may possess. Alicia's gaze drifted to the corridor beyond his shoulder, as though she might find the horizon she'd been searching for all her life waiting there. When she looked back, her voice was calm. "Tell Mr. Whitaker I won't be intimidated, I won't be balked." His mouth tightened. "You understand that pursuing this will not end well for you." "I've had 12 years of things not ending well," she said quietly. "I can survive 12 more." She closed the door before he could answer, her hands shaking as she leaned against the frame. Leah emerged silently, her expression a question she didn't voice. Alicia managed a single nod, her throat too tight for words. When the dawn came, she dressed in her uniform again and rode the bus back into the city. Her body felt hollow, as if her bones had been scraped clean by the effort of keeping her composure. But in her heart, something fierce and unbreakable had begun to grow. She would not let Damien erase her again. In the towering glass lobby, she signed the attendance log with hands that no longer trembled. The receptionist barely looked up, oblivious to the war Alicia was fighting behind her steady gaze. As she stepped into the elevator, she imagined Damien in his corner office, certain he had silenced her. She let herself picture his face when he finally realized she could no longer be pushed aside. She didn't know exactly when or how she would reveal the truth. But she knew one thing with perfect clarity. The days of her invisibility were over. The evening of the board dinner arrived with the kind of cold that sank through coats and skin until it settled in the bones. Alicia stood across the street from the Whitaker Holdings tower, the collar of her old wool coat pulled high against her jaw, her gloved hands tucked into her pockets. From here, the building looked less like an office and more like a monument, an edifice built of ambition, glass, and the silent understanding that some people would always remain outside its walls. She hadn't been invited tonight. She hadn't even been scheduled to work this late. But as the sky darkened and the lights bloomed in the upper floors, she knew she could not stay away. Something inside her had shifted irrevocably. She was tired of surviving in the shadows. When she finally crossed the street and approached the revolving door, the security guard at the front desk did not look up from his clipboard. She took a steadying breath and stepped through, her boots squeaking against the polished stone. Inside, the lobby gleamed in a warm glow of brass and cream marble. She moved purposefully past the reception desk toward the elevator bank. She had nearly reached the buttons when a voice stopped her. "Excuse me, miss." She turned slowly. The guard had finally looked up, his brows knitting in confusion as he took in her uniform. "I'm sorry," he continued, "but the service staff are supposed to use the back entrance after hours." Alicia met his gaze without blinking. "I'm not here to clean." His confusion deepened. "Then I'm going to need to see some identification." In that instant, she could have turned around. She could have walked back onto the street, disappeared again into the comforting anonymity she'd worn like armor. But she didn't. She reached into her bag and drew out the envelope she'd carried for 12 years. "I'm here to deliver something to Mr. Whitaker." The guard hesitated. "If you'll wait here, I can call up to his assistant." "No," she said, her voice calm. "I'll deliver it myself." He opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, another voice cut across the lobby. "Is there a problem?" Alicia turned to see Helen Whitaker striding across the marble floor. She wore a sleek charcoal suit, her dark hair coiled in an elegant twist. Even in the dim light, her presence was unmistakable, composed, unflinching. The guard straightened. "Miss Whitaker, this woman says she has a delivery for your brother." Helen's gaze flicked to the envelope in Alicia's hands, then back to her face. For a long, heavy moment, she simply looked at her. "Come with me," Helen said finally. Alicia's throat went tight with relief and apprehension in equal measure. She followed Helen past the guard's wide eyes and into the elevator, the doors sliding shut behind them with a hushed sigh. Neither woman spoke as the car ascended. The numbers above the door glowed steadily higher until they reached the executive floor. When they stepped out, Alicia saw the boardroom doors open ahead, light spilling into the hallway. Laughter and the faint clink of crystal drifted toward them. Helen stopped just short of the doorway and turned to her. "Are you sure you want to do this here?" Alicia lifted her chin. "I don't have anything left to lose." Helen studied her face for a long moment before nodding once. Without another word, she pushed open the doors. The room went silent. Inside, a dozen of the most powerful people in New York sat at a long table set with silver and white linen. Waiters stood along the wall, hands folded neatly behind their backs. At the head of the table, Damien rose slowly, his expression a mask of disbelief and irritation. "What is this?" he demanded, his gaze locked on Alicia. Helen's voice was quiet but firm. "She has something for you." Damien's eyes shifted to his sister, incredulity sharpening his features. "Helen, we're in the middle of—" "I know," she said, "but perhaps you should hear her out." Alicia's heart hammered so loudly she thought the entire room must hear it. She stepped forward until she stood across the gleaming table from Damien. In the candlelight, he looked older than she remembered, though no less formidable. "Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice low with warning, "I don't know what you think you're doing, but—" "I'm not here to disrupt your dinner," she interrupted, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I'm here because you left me no other choice." Murmurs rippled down the table. Damien's jaw clenched. "You are making a serious mistake." "Perhaps," she said. She laid the envelope gently on the white linen in front of him. "But I think we both know the bigger mistake happened 12 years ago." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. His hand hovered over the envelope but didn't touch it. "What is this?" "Proof," she said simply. He stared at her, the muscle in his cheek twitching. "Proof of what?" Her gaze did not waver. "That your children exist." A sharp intake of breath swept the table. Someone dropped a fork. A waiter shifted uncomfortably against the wall. Damien's lips parted, but no sound came. His fingers closed around the envelope as though it might vanish if he didn't hold it tightly enough. "You think you can blackmail me?" he asked, his voice brittle. "I'm not asking you for money," Alicia said. "I'm asking you to stop pretending I never existed, that they never existed." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the soft crackle of the fireplace behind the head chair. Damien's eyes dropped to the envelope, then lifted again, searching her face for something: weakness, regret, fear. But there was nothing left to find. "You should leave," he said finally, his voice low. "I will," she said. "But before I go, you should know that if you try to bury this—" She paused, drawing a deep breath. "I won't stay silent again." He said nothing. He didn't move. Helen stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on Alicia's arm. "I'll see her out," she murmured to the room, but her eyes were locked on her brother's. Damien did not look at her as she turned to go. He simply stared at the envelope as if it were a ticking bomb he could not disarm. Helen guided Alicia back into the hallway, the doors closing behind them with a soft click that seemed to echo in the hush. For a moment, they simply stood there in the dim corridor, the muffled sounds of resumed conversation seeping through the crack beneath the door. When Helen finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "That took more courage than I've seen in this building in years." Alicia swallowed hard. "I didn't come here to be brave. I came because I'm out of options." "Maybe," Helen said, her gaze thoughtful, "or maybe you're finally ready to take back the power he stole from you." Alicia didn't know how to answer that. Her hands were shaking now that it was over, adrenaline flooding her limbs until she thought she might collapse. Helen touched her elbow, steadying her. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" "I do," she lied. Helen's brow furrowed, but she didn't press. Instead, she handed her a card with her direct number printed in embossed silver. "If he retaliates, call me." Alicia closed her fingers around the card, feeling the weight of it settle into her palm. "Thank you." Helen studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once before turning back to the boardroom. Alicia walked to the elevator alone, her breath coming ragged in her throat. The cold, polished floor blurred beneath her eyes, and she blinked rapidly to clear the tears that threatened to spill. She refused to cry. Not here. Not where he might still be watching. As the elevator doors closed, she pressed her palm over her racing heart. For the first time since she had stepped back into the city, she felt something like relief, fragile and uncertain but real. She had done what she came to do. Outside, the wind tore at her coat as she stepped onto the sidewalk, but she hardly felt the cold. She turned her face up to the towering facade of Whitaker Holdings, the glass gleaming like the surface of a frozen lake. For 12 years, she had allowed this place, and the man who ruled it, to define the limits of her life. But no longer. Tonight, she had reminded him and herself that the past did not stay buried forever. She started down the sidewalk, her steps growing surer with every block she put between her and that glittering prison. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. The morning after the board dinner dawned as a storm finally broke over Manhattan, drenching the city in sheets of cold rain. Damian Whitaker stood alone in his office, staring at the envelope Alicia had left on the white linen tablecloth. He had not opened it the night before, though he had carried it home, as if he could somehow diminish its power by refusing to look inside. Now it sat on his desk, small and unassuming, yet heavier than any of the contracts or acquisition papers that had ever crossed it. Beyond the windows, gray clouds churned over the skyline, obscuring the view he usually found so satisfying. He had thought that success would make him untouchable, that once he had reached this summit, nothing could drag him back into the shadows of his past. But the envelope waited, quiet and patient, to prove him wrong. He pressed his palms flat against the edge of his desk and leaned over the document, his reflection warped in the polished surface. All night he had tried to imagine what he would say when the truth inevitably came out. No matter how many scenarios he conjured, none made him look like the man he had spent his life pretending to be. With a muttered curse, he tore the seal and unfolded the papers inside. A single sheet bore the heading of the same private laboratory he had once used to verify a competitor's DNA during a paternity lawsuit he'd funded in secret. He'd never imagined his own name would someday appear on such a document. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. He stared at the percentage as if it might change if he waited long enough. A drop of rain struck the window and slid down the glass in a crooked line. Damian set the paper aside with hands that no longer felt steady and dropped into his chair. 12 years ago, when Alicia had disappeared, he told himself it was a relief. He was too close to closing the largest deal of his career, too consumed by the need to prove that no trace of the boy from Queens remained. A child would have been an inconvenience, one more vulnerability he could not afford. He had signed the non-disclosure agreement himself, locking away that chapter as though it were an embarrassing error in judgment. But now, staring at the evidence of what he'd abandoned, he felt something hollow out the center of his chest. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. He looked up to see Helen standing there, a stack of folders balanced in her arms. For a moment, they only regarded each other, and Damian felt the old resentment rise between them. Her judgment, her cool disapproval of the man he'd become. "Are you going to pretend this never happened?" she asked without preamble. He didn't answer. Helen closed the door behind her and crossed the carpet, setting the folders on a side table. Her gaze dropped to the DNA report, then lifted again. "You knew," Damian said finally, his voice raw. "I suspected," she corrected quietly. "After you fired her the first time, she disappeared. No forwarding address, no explanation. It wasn't hard to guess." "You never said anything." Helen's expression softened. "Would you have listened?" He looked away, unable to summon a lie convincing enough to satisfy either of them. "She's not after your money," Helen said after a moment. "If she were, she would have come to you years ago." "She wants to humiliate me," Damian muttered. "No," Helen said. "She wants acknowledgement." He let out a brittle laugh. "Do you think there's a difference?" Helen regarded him in silence, and for the first time he felt how tired she looked. "Damian, you don't have to be this man anymore. I don't know how to be anyone else." He didn't wait for her reply. He turned his chair toward the rain-streaked windows and closed his eyes, as if darkness might give him some relief from the weight pressing down on his ribs. He felt Helen leave without another word, the door clicking shut behind her. Across the city, Alicia sat at the chipped formica table in the small kitchen of Leah's apartment, clutching a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The boys were at school, and the silence pressed against her like a second skin. She hadn't expected to feel so empty. She thought confronting Damian would bring a kind of triumph, or at least closure. Instead, she only felt the same exhaustion she'd carried for years. Leah appeared in the doorway, her arms folded. "You're waiting for him to call." Alicia didn't deny it. "He won't," Leah continued gently. "I know." Leah crossed the room and sat opposite her. "So what are you going to do?" Alicia stared down at her hands. "I don't know." But she did know. She had known the moment she laid the envelope on that table. She would not disappear again. Even if Damien never admitted the truth, she would not let her sons grow up believing they were unwanted. The phone rang then, jolting her out of her thoughts. For one dizzying instant, she thought it might be Damien. But when she picked up, a clipped male voice introduced himself as Victor Harris, one of Damien's attorneys. "Miss Monroe," Harris said, "I'd like to schedule a time to discuss a settlement." "There will be no settlement," she said before he could continue. "You're making this unnecessarily difficult." "No," she corrected softly, "I'm making this honest." There was a beat of silence on the line. When Harris spoke again, his tone was colder. "Then you leave us no choice but to take further action." "Do what you have to do," she said, and hung up. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down, but she felt no regret. Damien could send as many lawyers as he wanted. She would not be cowed this time. 2 days later, she stood at the entrance to the boys' school, her heart lurching when she saw them emerge in a cluster of chattering children. Noah spotted her first and broke into a grin that softened the ache in her chest. "Mom," he called, waving. She knelt as they reached her, gathering them into her arms. For a moment, the rest of the world receded, leaving only the familiar warmth of their small bodies against hers. "Can we get pizza?" Caleb asked, hopeful. "Please?" Ethan chimed in. She managed a laugh. "I think we can manage that." As they started down the sidewalk, a sleek black car pulled to the curb beside them. Alicia's steps faltered when the tinted window rolled down to reveal Helen. "I'm not here to make trouble," Helen said quickly. "May I speak with you a moment?" Alicia glanced at the boys, then back at Helen. "Can it wait?" Helen hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, but when you're ready, please call me." She handed Alicia a second card, this one embossed with a personal number rather than an office line. Before Alicia could reply, the window slid closed, and the car pulled away into traffic. That night, after the boys were asleep, she sat alone in the quiet apartment and turned the card over in her fingers. She knew Helen was not her enemy. But she also knew Damien would use every tool at his disposal to make her vanish again. She was still weighing whether to call when her phone vibrated. This time, the number was unfamiliar. With a deep breath, she answered. "Alicia." His voice was softer than she remembered. "Yes," she said carefully. "We need to talk," Damien said. She closed her eyes. "About the children?" "Yes." Silence stretched between them. "Tomorrow," he said finally. "My office, noon." "Fine." She ended the call before she could change her mind. When she lay down, sleep did not come. She lay in the darkness, listening to the rise and fall of the boys' breathing, and wondered if she had made a mistake. But beneath the uncertainty, something steady pulsed. For the first time, she felt she was standing on solid ground. She had told the truth. Whatever came next, she would not apologize for it. And she would never again be invisible. Damien didn't sleep the night before the meeting. He spent hours pacing the length of his penthouse apartment, trying to rehearse what he would say, how he would say it, and why it mattered that he said anything at all. At dawn, he stood at the window with a tumbler of whiskey, though he hadn't taken a single sip. He'd once believed that money and success would inoculate him against regret, that he could simply bury the past beneath accolades and profits. But Alicia's face at the dinner table had shattered that illusion as effortlessly as dropping a glass on marble. He arrived at his office before anyone else. The building was hushed, the lights still dim, the lobby echoing around him, as though the place itself were withholding judgment. When the elevator doors closed, he leaned against the wall and allowed himself a single moment to feel the panic that had been gnawing at him since she reappeared. Then the doors opened, and he was Damien Whitaker again, the man everyone respected because they had no idea what it cost him to become this person. At precisely noon, Alicia stepped into his office, her sons at her side. He hadn't expected her to bring them. For a second, that felt like the floor falling away. He couldn't find his voice. The boys looked just like he had at their age, and seeing them, 3 living replicas of the boy he'd tried to forget, was more humbling than any public scandal. Their eyes flicked around the room, taking in the chrome fixtures and the wall of windows that overlooked the city. He wondered what they saw when they looked at him. A stranger. A threat. Certainly not a father. "Thank you for coming," he said, forcing formality into his tone. Alicia gave no sign she noticed the strain in his voice. "They deserve to meet you." He nodded, though he had no idea if he agreed. His gaze shifted to the boys again. One of them, he thought it was Noah, stepped slightly in front of his brothers, as if he might shield them from whatever Damien was about to do. Damien gestured to the seating area by the windows. "Would you like to sit?" The boys exchanged glances, then moved cautiously toward the couches. Alicia remained standing. "Can I get you anything?" he asked, though he knew how hollow the question sounded. "No," she said simply. He rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. "I don't know how this is supposed to work." "Neither do I," she admitted. For a moment they stood there in the hush, the years between them rising like a wall neither knew how to scale. He thought of the day she'd vanished and realized with a twist of guilt that he hadn't even tried to find her. He'd told himself he was respecting her wishes, but really he'd been protecting himself. "I wasn't ready then," he said finally, his voice raw. Alicia's eyes softened, but her posture didn't. "I know." The boys sat silent on the couch, their small hands folded in their laps. Damien crossed to them and crouched so he was eye level, though his heart thudded so hard he felt lightheaded. "I'm Damien," he said, his throat tight. I know that doesn't mean anything to you yet, but I'd like the chance to change that." Caleb, the smallest of the three, frowned. "You're our dad." The word struck him harder than he'd expected. He cleared his throat. "Yes? Why didn't you come before?" Ethan asked, his voice small. Damien looked helplessly at Alicia, but she only watched him steadily, offering no rescue. He swallowed. "Because I was selfish and scared." Noah studied him with solemn curiosity. "Are you scared now?" He almost laughed because the answer was so obvious. "Yes, very." The boys exchanged glances. To his amazement, some of the tension in their shoulders eased. Alicia finally stepped forward and sat on the edge of the couch beside them. "I told them," she said, her voice quiet, "that you were very busy, that you didn't know how to be a dad yet." He looked at her, his throat too tight for words. She had given him more grace than he deserved. Caleb tugged at Alicia's sleeve. "Can we ask questions?" She nodded. Caleb turned to him, earnest. "Do you have any toys here?" A startled laugh escaped Damien. "Not in this office, but maybe next time you come, I could have some waiting?" Caleb looked at Alicia, who inclined her head, and then nodded. Damien exhaled shakily. It wasn't absolution, but it was something. After that, the conversation grew haltingly easier. The boys asked about the view, the elevator, whether Damien had a dog. He answered each question as best he could, aware that he was being studied and measured in ways no investor had ever managed. When at last Alicia rose to leave, he felt a rush of panic that he hadn't said enough, hadn't done enough to prove that he wanted this connection. "Wait," he said, his voice unsteady. "I know I have no right to ask, but would you let me see them again, outside the office?" Alicia hesitated. Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw something that looked like the faintest hope. "Let's take this one step at a time," she said. He nodded, trying not to let the disappointment show. He hadn't earned anything more. The boys filed past him toward the door. Noah paused and looked up, his gaze solemn. "Goodbye," he said. Damien managed a smile. "Goodbye." They were almost gone when Alicia turned back. "I didn't bring them here to hurt you," she said softly. "I know. But I won't let you hurt them." "I understand." She gave him one last searching look before she followed the boys out, the door closing with a soft click that left him standing alone in the vast, silent office. For a long time, he didn't move. The skyline stretched out beyond the glass, oblivious to the small earthquake that had shifted the fault lines of his life. He felt something crack open in his chest, a feeling he barely recognized. It was the beginning of accountability. That evening, Helen appeared in his doorway, her expression unreadable. "You did better than I expected," she said. He scrubbed a hand over his face. "I don't know if it matters." "It matters to them," she said. Damien dropped into his chair, feeling drained. "What if I can't fix this?" "You can't," Helen said. "But you can show up. That's more than you've done so far." He closed his eyes. "Do you think they'll ever forgive me?" Helen was silent for a long moment. When he looked up, she met his gaze with a gentleness he hadn't seen in years. I don't know, she admitted, but you'll never find out if you hide behind lawyers. That night, he didn't return to the penthouse. Instead, he walked the streets of the neighborhood where he'd grown up. The buildings were smaller, the windows dull with grime, but here he remembered the boy who had once believed love was something you earned by being useful. He wondered if Alicia had recognized that same hunger in him all those years ago, and whether she'd ever stop believing he might be a better man. When he finally returned to his car, he sat with the engine off and watched the rain streak the windshield. He was not ready. He was not worthy. But he was willing. And for the first time in his life, he thought that might be enough to start. The next week passed in a haze of headlines and phone calls, each more intrusive than the last. Word of Alicia's confrontation with Damien had leaked to the press. Someone on the board, Helen suspected, and the tabloids seized on it with the unrelenting hunger of scavengers. Damien woke every morning to fresh speculation printed in glossy colors across every newsstand in Manhattan. Headlines screamed about his secret family, his hidden heirs, and the cleaning lady who humbled a billionaire. Every time he saw one of those papers, a cold nausea pooled behind his ribs. His board was less interested in the moral implications than in the public relations catastrophe. By the time he walked into the Monday strategy meeting, the conference table was a battlefield littered with printouts and brand projections. The company's head of communications, a sleek, exhausted woman named Cora, looked as though she hadn't slept in days. "We need you to get ahead of this," she said without preamble. "Silence is not an option. The narrative is out of our control." Damien took his seat and looked around the table at the men and women he had led for a decade. Some met his eyes with frank disappointment. Others barely concealed their curiosity, as if they expected him to confess something sordid right there in the middle of quarterly forecasts. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. Cora straightened a stack of papers with hands that trembled just slightly. "A public statement acknowledging the children and expressing contrition. If you appear remorseful and proactive, we can reframe this as a personal matter that you're addressing responsibly. And if I don't, then the market will continue to assume you're hiding something worse," Cora said bluntly. He dragged a hand over his face, fighting the familiar urge to retreat behind deflection and strategy. For so long, he'd believed that appearances were the only reality that mattered. But now, with the eyes of the world on him, he felt the hollowness of that philosophy like a bruise. "I need time to think," he said. "You don't have time," Cora countered. "If you wait another week, your largest investors will walk." He left the meeting without committing to any course of action. The door had barely closed behind him when Helen appeared at his side. "Don't," he said wearily. "You can't hide from this," she told him. "I'm not hiding." "Yes, you are," she said, softer now. "But you don't have to." He looked at her, his voice low and raw. "If I stand up in front of all those cameras and admit everything, do you really think that changes anything for the boys?" "It changes everything," she said, "because it tells them you see them." He pressed his lips together, unable to answer. That evening, Alicia sat at the kitchen table, the twins working on their homework, while Noah pretended to read a library book and actually watched her. She could feel his scrutiny, as acutely as if he were speaking. "Mom," he said finally, "why is everyone talking about us?" Her hands stilled over the stack of papers she'd been sorting. "Because some grown-ups care more about gossip than kindness." "Is Mr. Whitaker in trouble?" She looked into his solemn face and saw 1,000 questions she didn't know how to answer. "Maybe," she said honestly. "But sometimes trouble is the only way people learn who they really are." "Is he going to disappear again?" The raw hope in Noah's voice made her chest ache. She reached across the table and took his hand. "I don't think so." The phone rang then, startling them both. She answered on the second ring, bracing herself for another reporter. But it was Damien's voice, rough and unsteady. "I'd like to see you," he said. "Why?" "Because I don't know what to do," he admitted. She closed her eyes. "Meet me tomorrow, somewhere neutral." He hesitated. "Where?" "There's a park on 86th and Riverside," she said. 1 o'clock. He didn't argue. When she hung up, she realized her hands were trembling. The next afternoon was bright and cold, the sky so blue it looked painted. She found a bench beneath a sycamore, her breath pluming in pale clouds. Damien arrived precisely at 1, dressed not in his usual armor of an expensive suit, but in a dark peacoat and plain slacks. For a moment, he looked so much like the young man she had known that her throat closed. He sat at the far end of the bench, his shoulders stiff. "I've been thinking about what you said." She didn't answer, letting him find his own way to whatever he needed to say. "I've spent my entire life trying to be invulnerable," he went on, "to prove that I could be more than where I came from, and now none of that matters." She studied his profile, the shadows beneath his eyes. "It matters," she said quietly, "just not in the way you think." He turned to face her fully, and for the first time she saw the fear he'd never allowed anyone to witness. "I don't know how to be a father," he said. "No one does," she told him. "They deserve better." She nodded. "They do. But better doesn't mean perfect. It means present." He looked down at his gloved hands, twisting them together. "I'm going to hold a press conference tomorrow. I'm going to tell the truth." Her breath caught. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," he said, "because I can't look them in the eye again if I keep pretending this isn't real." She swallowed against the surge of emotion that rose in her throat. "It will be ugly. They'll tear you apart." He managed a hollow smile. "They already have." They sat in silence, and the wind stirring the dry leaves around their feet. For a moment, she allowed herself to remember the boy he had been and the man he was still struggling to become. "Will you be there?" he asked finally, his voice low. "Yes," she said. He nodded, and they sat together until the cold drove them apart again. That evening, Damien returned to the penthouse he had once believed was proof of his success. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at the city glittering beneath him. For the first time in years, he felt no satisfaction. Only the sober awareness that everything he had built was balanced on a lie he no longer had the strength to maintain. The following morning dawned bleak and overcast. Reporters began gathering outside the building hours before the conference. By noon, the lobby was a frenzy of camera crews and shouting voices. Alicia arrived with the boys, her heart hammering. She had dressed them in their best clothes, trying to armor them in small ways she knew wouldn't be enough. Helen met them at the entrance and guided them past the flashing bulbs, her expression composed but her hand steady on Alicia's shoulder. Inside the auditorium, Damien stood behind the podium, a bank of microphones arrayed before him like the barrels of a firing squad. He looked out at the sea of cameras and faces, his gaze landing on the first row where Alicia and the boys sat. He took a deep breath and the room fell silent. "I've called you here because there is something I need to say," he began, his voice clear despite the tremor beneath it. "For years, I believed that success could insulate me from my past, that if I achieved enough, no one would ever know the parts of me I was ashamed of." He paused, scanning the crowd until his gaze settled on Noah, who watched him with wide, unblinking eyes. "But the truth doesn't disappear because you ignore it," he continued, "and neither do the people you fail." He swallowed hard. 12 years ago, I made a choice that hurt someone who deserved better. I abandoned my responsibility and pretended it never existed. Today, I am here to acknowledge that mistake. He looked directly into the cameras. "Alicia Monroe is the mother of my children. Noah, Ethan, and Caleb are my sons. And whatever happens to my reputation or my company, I will no longer deny them." A flurry of questions erupted, but he lifted a hand and silence fell again. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly, "but I am asking for the chance to do better." The room exploded into noise as reporters shouted over each other, but Damien stepped back from the podium, his face pale and set. He didn't look at Alicia as security ushered him toward the side exit, but she saw the moment his shoulders eased as though a burden had finally slipped free. She gathered the boys and led them out past the gauntlet of cameras, her head high. No matter what came next, this truth belonged to them now. And no one, not the press, not the board, not the fear that had ruled them all, could take it away again. The days that followed the press conference were a blur of headlines, speculation, and the steady hum of consequences rolling across Damien's carefully constructed world. In the span of 72 hours, 3 of the company's major investors announced their intent to pull funding. 2 board members resigned in protest of the scandal. For the first time since he had founded Whitaker Holdings, Damien sat alone at the head of the conference table and felt the hollow victory of telling the truth. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like the disorienting silence that followed an earthquake, when you didn't know whether the ground would settle or split apart beneath your feet. On the morning of the fourth day, he received a call from Helen. Her voice was calm, but he recognized the weariness that threaded through it. She didn't ask if he was all right. She already knew. "You should come down to the community center," she said. "Why?" "Because Alicia and the boys are here." He didn't allow himself to hesitate. Before the hour was up, he was driving across town, the sky overcast and low with the threat of rain. The city he had once ruled with a kind of quiet arrogance now felt like a place that might swallow him whole. As he parked along the cracked curb, he took a long breath and tried to gather the courage he'd never needed for a business deal, but found impossible when it came to his own life. Inside, the center was crowded with parents and children waiting for after-school activities. Murals lined the cinder-block walls, bright colors that made the place feel warmer than any of the boardrooms he'd ever occupied. He spotted Helen near the sign-in table, and when she met his eyes, she didn't smile. Instead, she lifted her chin toward the far end of the hall, where Alicia sat with the boys, helping them assemble a science project. For a moment, Damien only watched them. He had never learned how to belong in a moment like this, where no one cared about quarterly profits or media spin, where there was no winning strategy. Caleb leaned against Alicia's side, Ethan balanced a pair of scissors too big for his hands, and Noah gestured with the earnest gravity of a child who believed every idea mattered. When he finally walked over, he half expected Alicia to send him away. But she looked up calmly, her gaze neither warm nor cold, and inclined her head in quiet acknowledgement. "Hi," he said, feeling absurdly inadequate. "Hi," she returned. The boys fell silent, their eyes big and searching. Noah was the first to speak. "Did you really tell everyone about us?" Damien swallowed. "Yes, I told them the truth." Ethan's voice was hesitant. "Did they get mad at you?" He forced a smile. "Some did." Caleb frowned. "Are you in trouble?" "Maybe a little," he admitted, "but it was the right thing to do." There was a long pause, during which Alicia's hand rested lightly on Noah's shoulder. Then Noah leaned forward across the table, his brow furrowed. "So, what happens now?" Damien wished he had an easy answer. Instead, he crouched so he was eye-level with all three of them. "Now, I hope we can figure that out together." Alicia exhaled softly, as if she'd been holding her breath. She met his eyes over the boys' heads, and in that look, he felt something shift. A recognition that neither of them could undo the past, but maybe they could build something truer in its place. Helen joined them a few minutes later, and the group drifted into a fragile rhythm of conversation. Damien sat beside the boys as they explained their project, a cardboard model of the solar system, and tried to answer questions he hadn't thought about since he was their age. Each time he spoke, he felt them assessing him, deciding whether he deserved their trust. After an hour, Alicia touched his elbow gently. "Can I talk to you outside?" He followed her into the brisk afternoon air, the door closing behind them with a hush that felt almost solemn. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind teased a loose strand of her hair across her cheek, and he was struck by how tired she looked, though her posture remained unbowed. "I didn't bring them here to pressure you," she said quietly. "I know. But I need you to understand something," she continued, her gaze steady. "They don't need your money. They don't even need your name. They need to know they matter to you." He swallowed hard. "I'm trying." "I can see that," she said, "but trying isn't the same as showing up." Her words weren't cruel, they were simply true. He looked down at his hands, remembering how often he had used work as an excuse to avoid anything that made him vulnerable. He didn't want to be that man anymore. "Will you let me try to be here?" he asked, lifting his gaze to hers. Alicia studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Yes, but you have to understand, it will take time." "I know," he said. "And if you ever walk away again," she added, her voice soft but unyielding, "I won't let you back in." The finality in her tone sent a chill down his spine, but he didn't look away. "I won't," he said. For the first time, she seemed to believe him. They went back inside together, and when the boys spotted them, they didn't tense. Caleb even reached for Damien's hand as he passed, and the simple gesture made something unspool in his chest. He hadn't realized how much he needed it until that moment. The next weeks unfolded in a series of small, tentative steps. Damien began joining them at the community center twice a week, sitting through science projects and art classes, sometimes saying little more than a quiet greeting. The boys watched him with cautious curiosity, testing the edges of his presence. Each time, he stayed. The tabloids eventually moved on to new scandals. The board meetings grew quieter as the shock faded, replaced by a tense, pragmatic acceptance. Damien knew he had forfeited some respect in those circles, but he also knew he had found something more important than their approval. One Friday afternoon, Alicia invited him to pick the boys up from school. He arrived early, waiting outside the gates as the last bell rang. When they emerged in a rush of laughter and backpacks, Noah spotted him first. He didn't run, but he didn't look away either. "Hi," Noah said, his voice careful. "Hi," Damien replied. "How was your day?" Noah shrugged. "Okay. Do you want to get ice cream?" Noah glanced at his brothers, then back at Damien. "Okay." It was such a small word, but to Damien, it felt like the first clear sign that the walls were starting to come down. They walked down the block together, the boys chattering in low voices, and for the first time, he let himself imagine what it might feel like to belong in their lives. Not as a stranger or a cautionary tale, but as something resembling a father. Later that evening, when he returned them to Alicia, she watched him carefully as the boys tumbled inside. "They seemed happy," she observed. "They were," he said. She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded once, as though she had come to a decision she hadn't quite shared with him. "Thank you," she said quietly. He hesitated, searching for words that didn't feel inadequate. "I know I can't fix what I did." "No," she said, "but you're trying. That counts for something." He watched her close the door behind her, the sounds of the boys' laughter filtering through the thin walls. He stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of his choices settle around him like an old coat he was finally ready to shrug off. For so long, he had been afraid that the truth would destroy him. But as he walked back to his car, he realized it had done something else instead. It had set him free. In the months that followed, they learned how to be a family in fits and starts. There were awkward silences and small triumphs, moments of doubt and surprising grace. Damien understood that he could never erase the years he'd lost, but he could show up for the ones ahead. And in the end, that was all any of them had ever needed. This story is a powerful reminder that no amount of success, wealth, or public admiration can shield us from the consequences of the choices we make in our private lives. Damien Whitaker built an empire and convinced himself that burying the truth would keep him safe. But the truth has a way of surfacing when we least expect it, demanding accountability. His journey shows that acknowledging our failures, no matter how long we've hidden from them, is the first step toward healing and redemption. Alicia's courage demonstrates the quiet strength it takes to stand up for what is right, even when the world tries to silence you. She could have chosen revenge or resentment, but instead, she chose honesty and dignity, not only for herself but for her children. In the end, the boys didn't need Damien to be perfect. They only needed him to be present. The lesson here is simple yet profound. We can't undo the past, but we can own it. We can choose to show up, to tell the truth, and to do better. The road to forgiveness is often long and uncertain, but it begins with a single, sincere step. When we find the courage to face the consequences of our actions, we open the door to growth and connection. No matter how far we stray, it is never too late to choose integrity over image, love over pride, and truth over silence. Where are you watching this story from? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you found this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. Thank you for being here.